Good afternoon. It's been a great day so far, so I hope I can keep that up. As Paul said, I'm Matthew Willcox, and I'm the Executive Director of Draft FCB's Institute of Decision Making. This is our logo. Now, it's got a big brain on it, and there's a reason for that. Some research published in the journal Cognition shows that assertions about psychology, even implausible ones like watching television makes you better at mathematics, seem much more believable to lay people when accompanied by images of brain scans. And a paper from the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience demonstrates that adding even an extraneous reference to the brain to a bad explanation of human nature or human behavior makes the explanation seem much more satisfying to non-experts. So that's the reason why, basically, if I can have anything that makes my bad explanations of human behavior better, I'll take it. So I'm going to liberally scatter pictures of brains to all of the things I do. So the Institute of Decision Making came up a few years ago when I was asked to define marketing. We've actually had quite a few definitions of marketing today. And I was asked to come up with a kind of a modern definition that sort of was agnostic of all media and things like that. And I think what I came up with was neither original nor particularly modern, but at least it was simple. And it was that marketing is influencing people's decisions. This obviously relates very directly to buying, because buying is a decision. And everything we do is about influencing decisions, whether it's influencing people's decision to stop doing something, influencing their decision to start doing something, to continue doing something. And I kind of realized that I actually didn't know very much about how people make decisions. By the way, my notes are not moving from slide to slide. Is that... Okay. I don't know if we can... so forgive me if I stumble over stuff. So I didn't know very much about sort of influencing people's decisions. And I was kind of like, you know, as a planner for a number of years, I knew about sort of... I'd spent a lot of time thinking about how people choosing categories, thinking about sort of how people, you know, sort of what are their emotional connections with brands. But I had little understanding of the basic nature of human decision-making. I felt kind of pretty bad about this until I realized that most of my peers and colleagues had little idea as well, which sounds like a damning thing to say, but it was just kind of something I think you don't really think about that much. So I started trying to sort of find out more about it, and this became kind of an odyssey and a bit of a voyage. And kind of the interesting thing is that the place you might think of looking is the world of commerce. You know, all of the market research, the billions of dollars that are spent on market research might give you some understanding of the sort of basic nature of decision-making. But actually, the real insight is coming from another place. It's coming from the world of academia. And, you know, sort of just going through a number of the journals that publish decision-making science papers, publish behavioral papers, there's probably about 1,000 really high-quality, peer-reviewed papers that have been published in the last 5 years or so. So I think this is kind of interesting, because it means that for most decisions that a marketer, that any of us might want to influence, someone somewhere will have done a lot of work in it, sometimes spent their career, their academic career, looking at this whole area. And yet we don't really spend that much time looking at that great resource. And so that really became my mission, was really to try and connect these dots, to connect the dots between the research in academia about understanding human behavior and decision-making and what we do with our clients in terms of marketing. Actually, sort of this research has, a lot of the work that these academics do has kind of fueled a sort of a large chunk of the sort of the non-fiction publishing category. You'll be familiar with some of these books. The one in the top corner is Gerald Zaltzman's How Customers Think, and he talks in that about how 95% of decision-making is unconscious. Gary Klein was a pioneer of a field called naturalistic decision-making, which is kind of understanding how people make decisions under pressure. It's kind of, his work's been used, he observed the armed forces and emergency services, and his work's been used to kind of help them sort of make better decisions under the intense pressure they're under. He talks about how 90% of the critical decisions we make are based on our intuition. Brain Juicer talked about System 1 and System 2 in their excellent sort of three-ring circus session. You know, one of the authors who's popularized this is the father of behavioral economics, Daniel Kahneman. And he talks about how the intuitive system is more influential than your experience tells you, and is the secret author of many of the choices and judgments that you make. And this, I think, is a really beautifully written little paragraph, because it's this notion that it is extremely powerful, yet we're not aware of how it drives our decision-making. And then Dan Ariely, who's been a great friend of the Institute of Decision Making, with his book Predictably Irrational, talks about how people are deeply irrational, yet predictably so. I think my favorite quote about irrationality actually doesn't come from a scientist, but it comes from a science fiction writer, Robert Heinlein, which is that sort of man is not a rational animal, but a rationalizing animal. And that's pretty much on the money. Yes, we do, our deliberative system plays a huge part in our decision-making, but very often it is to rationalize the emotional and intuitive decisions that we've made. Now, these discoveries, this understanding of human nature and decision-making will only increase with the emergence of, there's so many bright people studying this. I was recently at the Society of Judgment and Decision-Making conference in Minneapolis, and there are hundreds of academics presenting papers. The figure I gave for the amount of papers presented is dwarfed by the amount of poster sessions that graduate students do. Some of them are really interesting. I saw one recently, which was just a very simple little study where they had got people to sort photographs that related to the past and to the future, and they gave them photograph albums to put them into. And what they saw sort of pretty consistently, regardless of what the album was, that they put the photographs relating to the past on the left-hand side and the photographs relating to the future on the right-hand side. This was not done with any marketing sort of aims in mind, but that's a great little piece of information for somebody who's doing user interface or a retail display to think, hang on a second, if I'm trying to sort of make my product look more modern, maybe I put it to the right side of things. If I've got a range of products and I want to show a hierarchy of more modern, more contemporary, that might be a way to do it as well. And the literature is littered with sort of interesting little studies like that. But not only is there a lot of people studying things, there's also some great technological advances as well. One of which is the increased access to behavioral researchers of fMRI machines. So fMRI machines, as many of you will know, there's big kind of magnets that you kind of lie in, and you have to take your jewelry off before you get into them. They're not very practical for market research, because you have to, first of all, it's difficult enough to persuade people to come to a focus group facility, let alone have them lie in a piece of medical equipment which they've probably only seen if they've been seriously ill or thought they're seriously ill. And you have to then clamp people's head in place while they're in it. And then what the machine does is it measures where the oxygenated blood is going to in the brain. So it gives you an accurate indication of where brain activity is. So these things were difficult to find outside medical schools until about 10 years ago, but now they are accessible. The people I work with at Stanford have two of the machines. They have one which is actually linked up to, it's the only one in the world that's linked up to an olfactometer, so they can actually sort of see what's happening in people's brains when they're exposed to certain smells. And this has kind of led to a new branch called neuroeconomics, which I think kind of is going to bring some really interesting understanding to marketers. And I kind of feel, I suppose I would, because it's kind of what I do, but this is perhaps going to lead to as much of a revolution in marketing as digital has led in previous years. This greater understanding of the realities of human behavior, of how the brain works, will just, I think, sort of change the nature of marketing in many ways. So I want to give an example of this. Time is kind of an interesting thing when it comes to decision-making. I mentioned sort of earlier on, there are people who study various things. There's a guy I met called Jeff Jurman, who's at the Washington State University. This is what he studies. He studies what are called the temporal factors on decision-making, how time affects how people make decisions. And that's what he does. He's written books about it and stuff like that. But I want to talk about sort of, let's do a little behavioral experiment first. I'm going to sort of, if I was to offer you, because my water bottle defies gravity, if I was to offer you £50 now, there's £50 in this envelope. Okay, you can have this now. Or, on the other hand, there's £100 in this envelope, which I will put in a safe place for you to retrieve in a year's time. Which one would you prefer? Quick show of hands. £50 now, £100 in the future. What do you want? Which one? Now? Oh, you're wonderful. You're wonderful. I thought maybe we'd get like sort of 60 or 70%. Yeah, most of you said you want the £50 now. And in so doing, you've turned down a rate of return of about 100%, which is more than you could get if you were to fix LIBOR. I mean, it's kind of, that's a pretty impressive return. Now, but, you know, don't feel bad about it. You did it because your human animal was kind of guiding you to do that. It's human nature. We put less value on something in the future than we do on the same thing in the present. Behavioral economists call this temporal or hyperbolic discounting. And this discounting of the future is why it's really difficult to get people to do things that actually may be good for them in the future. It's very difficult to get people to save for retirement. It's very difficult to get people to adopt good, healthy practices now when the benefit is going to be in the future. And the interesting thing is that it's not just human nature, it's nature. Squirrels actually, when they see nuts, they eat the best nuts now and hoard the less good nuts for the future, because there's that level of uncertainty. So this is not just wired into our DNA. This is what we inherited as behavior from our ancestors. And it's not surprising. Kind of what we try to do is, you know, there's often that you can get a sense of things from behavioral experiments. That's what Brain Juicer were doing in the break. It's also interesting kind of think about some of the evolutionary psychology or the reasons in evolution that sort of that account for some of these things. And, you know, if you just simply, one of the people I've been talking to, I may not have the best job in advertising, but I do get to talk to some interesting people. And a couple of months ago, I was talking to a professor called Dean Falk, who is a paleoneurologist. And so what she does is she examines fossils to try to understand the evolution of the brain. And she was the person, I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, they discovered what they thought was a new species of hominid. And there was a big debate as to, it was called the Hobbit Man in Indonesia. And there was a big debate as to whether this was a new species or whether it was a deformed version of Homo erectus, which is such a wonderful name. And and she basically, through sort of carrying out sort of imaging studies of the fossils, was able to work out this was indeed a brand new species. And it was called Homo floresiensis. Now, you know, if you kind of think about sort of the future, really it hasn't been on our agenda for very long. So the brain's been evolving for about 6 million years, according to people like Dean Falk. That is the hominid brain, so a lot of that is our ancestors. Homo sapiens came on the scene about 200,000 years ago. And so much of our decision-making systems, I mean, there's been a theme, I think, from other speakers about history, and I think I'm trumping all of them. I mean, some people went back to the Middle Ages, to the 19th century. I'm going back 6 million years. But this is the age, you know, this is when our decision-making systems started to evolve. And if you look at life expectancy, I mean, just taking sort of Homo sapiens at 200,000 years, you know, sort of 60,000 BC, the estimate is it was about 16 years. By 1000 BC, about 18 years. By 100 BC, about 25 years. So if you work that out, that's about, for 99% of human existence, life expectancy has been around 25 years. So perhaps not surprising as the way we make judgments has evolved, we haven't paid much attention to the future. It's not surprising that we discount it because there wasn't much retiring going on, you know, sort of before the beginning of the 20th century. So an interesting kind of piece of work, again, there I am with the pictures of the brain to sort of make this seem more satisfying. This is from a fascinating study by Hal Hershfield, who was at Stanford at the time. And he asked people to consider, he asked them sort of to think about sort of 4 different conditions. Consider themselves now, consider themselves in the future, consider someone else now, and consider someone else in the future. And they were doing this while they were in an fMRI machine with their heads kind of clamped in place and stuff like that. Lots of noise and people in white coats. And what he was looking for was what would happen at the rostral anterior cingulate, which is that sort of yellow area of the brain there, which is believed to show activity when people start thinking about things concerning self. So what they saw were these results, and this is kind of interesting. So I've given you 4 conditions. 2 conditions about time, and 2 conditions about self or other. So you might expect that you get 2 sets of lines quite similar, or maybe all 4 lines would be the same, but as you can see from that, 1 line is an outlier. You've got 3 following the same curve, 1 doing something different. Anybody care to hazard a guess as to which one was doing the different thing? Any thoughts? Self now? Self now, self here. Self now is exactly the right answer. And it's kind of interesting. I felt this study as a reforming planner this kind of spoke to me because this kind of gives you the level of insight that planners look for. Very often, neurosciences look to either confirm things that we know already. So, for example, some work has been done recently to show that that if you tell people the price, if you tell people that a wine is more expensive, they enjoy it more. So that's been confirmed through an fMRI study done by a professor at INSEAD. But a lot of it is kind of confirming stuff we knew. What I think is interesting about this is it kind of makes you think about things differently. So if you kind of extrapolate that, the idea that yourself in the future is like a stranger is quite an interesting insight that you could start planning communication off of. It actually isn't a question of saying, think about yourself now. It's kind of how do you stop that tension between this notion that somebody in the future is actually pretty much a stranger to them? Another area I wanted to talk about, oh, yeah, so there's the slide with the things on it. Another area I wanted to talk about a bit was information overload, and this is another little history lesson, but information overload is as old as the hills. In fact, Seneca the Elder said in the 1st century AD, the abundance of books is a distraction, which is kind of, I'm trying to think, where did he get all those books from? It's kind of, I mean, this is pre-Gutenberg by like, sort of 1,000+ years. Yeah, Erasmus said, is there anywhere on earth exempt from these swarms of new books? And the 18th century Germans had a word, Büchersuche, apologies to any Germans in the audience for that probably very bad pronunciation, which means plague of books to describe this. And of course, then you've got Alvin Toffler coming along in the 1970s, writing Future Shock and coining actually the term information overload. But it's kind of interesting. If you talk to consumers, they don't necessarily feel this when it comes to information about products and marketing. We did one of the studies we do a big global study called New Realities. And New Realities, the birth of this was really kind of understanding how people use information and how they make decisions in the digital information age. And we do it across, this is across 5 pretty important economies. We're adding Russia and the UK next year. And this is people strongly agreeing to these statements. Top 3 boxes. Information is my friend. Information gives me control in my buying decisions. Information availability has made me more confident in brand choices. Increased information, more information has also increased my satisfaction with brands. So this is kind of interesting because, if you look at the literature, actually, if people are trying to make decisions, more information is the worst thing you can give them. And a lot of studies, both stuff, these are 2 excellent books. Paradox of Choice is actually one of the books that kind of got me started my interest in this area. It's actually a good book for us to all read as, not just as marketers, but people who make decisions day to day as well. But they've done, Barry Schwartz talks about sort of studies in this book where people have actually been given an extra set of information for a choice, and it's led them to make worse choices and actually sort of, led them to become less happy decision makers. So it's kind of interesting, and I think I was kind of thinking, well, how might you resolve this paradox? What might the reason be? And there's a really interesting, this is a little bit of a diversion, but there's a really interesting branch of research called embodied cognition. It's a really interesting area. I think marketers have yet to sort of make as much of this as they might do. And embodied cognition is about sort of how physical manifestations of metaphors affect your attitudes and behavior. So for example, you talk about a book being a heavy read. We don't mean that the book is literally heavy, but it's a serious read, and we use that metaphor to describe it. And in a study published in Psychological Science, researchers found that if you gave people a survey on an unweighted clipboard versus on a clipboard which had a sort of a weight of about 1 pound built into it, they would take the task more seriously, they would answer it more consistently, and they would spend more time doing it. This study is called the Weighty Clipboard Test, which I think is kind of a nice name. It's also been replicated with resumes, excuse me, that's my 14 years in San Francisco, with curriculum vitae. I always get caught out by words. I haven't picked up an accent, but I find myself leaving money on bars and using strange words. And the Zs or the Zs, they keep cropping up in my spelling as well. But this has been replicated with CVs where, kind of people will take a CV, they will think the candidate is more qualified when the same CV is presented on a heavier clipboard. So it's a really interesting kind of area. And I kind of wondered, well, actually, was there some embodied cognition stuff, kind of virtual embodied cognition sort of happening here, which was that sort of, even if people weren't using the information, maybe they were kind of feeling the effect of it in some way. And it kind of turns out there's an interesting guy, a really talented professor and researcher at London Business School called David Farrow. And he's been looking at this. I'll give you the abstract from his research. Merely having a task-relevant product, what he did was he did a number of studies, but two which are most relevant were giving people access to coffee when they were doing an attention task, and giving people access to a dictionary when they were meant to be solving a word puzzle. Now, they had access to it, but they didn't use it. And what he found was that sort of merely having a task-relevant product available for consumption without actually consuming it can improve performance, and participants with access to a dictionary solve more word puzzles than those without access to a dictionary. This study is called Merely Available. Now, I think this is kind of interesting, because this has got pretty big implications for marketers. We tend to think about sort of marketing information as being worthwhile investing in if people are using it. And actually, it may well be sort of just the effect of it being there sometimes is more important, or as important, in terms of actually boosting people's confidence. It's kind of that the information is there. And I think that sort of, to some extent, explains what we found in our research, which was this idea that sort of, yes, more information is good, not because I use it, but because it makes me feel more confident. Knowing it's there helps my confidence in decision-making. And this has been kind of, I think, one of my epiphanies my personal epiphanies in 2012, which is this notion of confidence in decision-making and how important it is. Back to the new realities research, one of the questions was, about people looking at information or looking for information after they've made a purchase. And what we saw was that actually quite high numbers of people are paying attention to or noticing information, but even high numbers are actually sort of seeking that information out, about things they've already made decisions about, which is kind of an interesting thing for people to admit in a quantitative study, because it's kind of, it's not the sort of thing you necessarily say you might do. And, this is sort of interesting, because I think it again relates to this notion of sort of increasing people's confidence in their decisions. So we spoke to some neuroscientists and behavioral economists about this and said, well, kind of what might be some of the reason? And part of the explanation probably lies in dopamine, which is the kind of the feel-good chemical in our brain. It's part of the reward system. Reed Montague, who's a pioneering neuroscientist, did a really interesting piece of research where they replicated the Pepsi challenge in an fMRI machine and actually sort of saw that the branded effect of Coke made people neurally prefer Coke over Pepsi. Talks about dopamine. He says you're probably 99.9% unaware of a dopamine release, but you're probably 99.9% driven by the information and emotions it conveys to other parts of the brain. And this notion of dopamine, turns out that sort of the Brown Institute for Brain Science had been doing some research. Bradley Doll had done some research looking at confirmation bias. And it turns out that actually when you get your behavior affirmed in some way, it creates an expression of dopamine. So this is kind of interesting. So people aren't just looking for information about decisions they've made to rationally affirm their decision, or even to feel good about the decision. They're doing it because it makes them feel good. It makes them feel chemically good. And this is a really interesting thing, the notion that our decisions can actually make us feel good with no good reason other than we've had an expression of dopamine as a result of them. Babashiv is somebody I've spent some time with this year. He's a professor at Stanford Graduate Business School. And this kind of notion of people feeling good and confident about their decisions is valuable not just to the people feeling it, but to marketers as well. He talks about how when people feel confident about their decisions, two things happen. First, they derive more utility from the product. So I will hit the ball far further with that golf club where I've been confident of my purchase, of my process of buying it, or that wine will taste nicer if I'm confident in my decision to buy it. And secondly, their excitement makes their decision more contagious. They're actually natural advocates. I think very often we look for influencers and neglect the fact that people who are satisfied or have had a good experience with the product may be our best influencers. And I sort of, as I was kind of looking at sort of quotes about decision-making, I found this one. You might recognize it. We're all faced throughout our lives with agonizing decisions. Some are on a grand scale. Most of these choices are on lesser points. But we define ourselves by the choices we've made. We're, in fact, the sum total of our choices. And this was by Professor Louis Levy. So Louis Levy was a fictional character in Woody Allen's film Crime and Misdemeanors. So I suppose this is less philosophy and more philosophy. But there is a good point here, which is that our decisions, both trivial and important, have enormous power to make us feel good or bad. And we all know that from our lives. We make a little small decision like buying the wrong sandwich at lunch and we feel bad about it. And then when somebody tells us, oh, that was a good decision to buy that, or we see something, somebody says, I bought this because I saw you had it, we feel actually very, very good about it. And so going back to my earlier definition of marketing about influencing decisions, perhaps the real power of marketing isn't just influencing decisions, but making people feel good about those decisions. And I think sort of, you know, that's if I was to leave you with a thought today, it would be perhaps think about how you might do that more in the work you do in your marketing, and indeed in our everyday lives, because making someone feel good about a decision makes them feel good, and that's got to be a pretty good thing. So thank you very much indeed.